RiseAbsorb is redefining what growers expect from phosphate fertilizer. Backed by data and built for performance, RiseAbsorb helps reduce phosphorus losses, improve uptake, and boost ROI without increasing input costs. Join the next wave of growers switching to the next generation of phosphorus fertilizers by visiting phospholutions.com.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host for the day, Lyndsey Smith. It is Wednesday, October 22nd. Not sure what the weather is like where you are, but here in the Ottawa Valley, it is finally raining. And I got to tell you, after the very dry summer, very dry fall that we've been having, it is incredibly welcome. The cover crops are soaking it up and continuing to grow. We've had a couple frosts, of course, but we've got some very frost-tolerant species out there, and the sheep are very happy to be munching on green stuff this late in the year. And we're hoping to, of course, just keep going well past when the snow flies, if we can do it. Hoping you are well. Thank you so much for joining me here and making RealAg Radio a part of your workday. We've got a special show for you today. If you're in the Canadian cattle industry for sure, and likely if you're involved in the American cattle industry, you've probably heard the name Dennis Laycraft. On today's show, Shaun Haney sits down with Dennis Laycraft, who has announced his retirement from the Canadian Cattle Association. He's also, of course, going to be honored in just a few short weeks with his induction with the Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame. So you might remember last Monday, we heard from Dory Gingerra-Boscheman. Shaun spoke with her ahead of her induction as well. He's actually going to have a conversation with each of the inductees, and we will play them here on RealAg Radio throughout the coming weeks. We, of course, will also have them posted on our YouTube channel and RealAgriculture.com. So if you missed Dory's episode, or if as we go forward you'd like to find them, maybe share them with people who should hear them, please find them there on YouTube or of course on RealAgriculture.com. You can download the podcast. You can of course find RealAg Radio wherever you get your audio. All right, so for those who maybe aren't as familiar with Dennis Laycraft, he is, of course, as I mentioned, a key component of the Canadian agriculture industry. In today's discussion, he's going to reflect, of course, on his career dedicated to the Canadian beef industry, touch on his ranching roots from near Nanton, Alberta. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that reflects on the time of the BSE crisis that happened in the early 2000s with the Canadian cattle herd. I remember where I was when we got word that a cow had tested positive for BSE. And of course, Laycraft was a key component of the Canadian industry as it grappled with that just devastating news and the years that followed. So Shaun and Dennis together traced the evolution of Canada's cattle sector over the last 30 plus years and really stressed the importance of trade, traceability, and of course the resilience that has defined this industry. An industry, of course, that is doing pretty great right now, but certainly there are some headwinds that Laycraft will refer to, I'm sure. So stick around. We are going to hear from Dennis Laycraft, inductee into the Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame, and Shaun Haney right after this.
Kochia sucks.
Big time. And hate it. Really gets in the way. Awful.
But not anymore. Get a head start on tough-to-kill weeds like kochia this fall with Volterra EZ and Fierce EZ soil-active herbicide. Apply after harvest before freeze-up for up to 8 weeks of extended control in pulses, soybeans, and wheat next spring. Volterra EZ, Fierce EZ for kochia. Visit newfarm.ca/kochia.
I get to spend every day talking to farmers in the ag industry through RealAgriculture.com and RealAg Radio. But nothing is more fun than speaking to an audience live and in person. If you're planning an ag event, book a Real Agriculture speaker to make it a successful and memorable experience. Email shaney@realagriculture.com and you can book myself or any other Real Ag personality to speak at your event. Bring your audience all the fun, insight, and energy of Real Agriculture.
Soil health is under pressure, but real solutions start below the surface. Black Earth offers a full suite of humic solutions, from high-purity granules to powder, liquid, and soluble formulations, all powered by pure Humulite. Formulated for performance, backed by consistency, trusted by growers worldwide from one of the world's rarest reserves. Grow stronger with the power of Black Earth Humulite. Learn more from Mine to Market at blackearth.com.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. It is Wednesday, October 22nd, and with your canola in the bin, it's time to lock up savings for next year's season. Act now and save up to $75 per bag on DeKalb canola with Harvest Rewards, but only until October 31st. Visit DeKalbRewards.ca for details. Well, as promised, we go now to the beginning of our conversation with Shaun Haney and Dennis Laycraft, reflecting on several decades of a career in the Canadian cattle industry.
Well, we're taking this journey, walking through and talking to all of the 2025 inductees into the Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame. So one of the inductees that I've known quite well, maybe I've interviewed the most throughout my career, is Dennis Laycraft, who is Executive Vice President with the Canadian Cattle Association. Dennis, how are you?
I'm great, Shaun. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And Dennis, congratulations. This is very well deserved when I think of contributions to the Canadian industry, well, to Canada, and the work you've done beyond our borders. Congratulations, very well deserved.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it coming from you. So.
Okay, so when you got the phone call, you heard about this, what was your reaction knowing that you were going to be an inductee into the 2025 class?
To be honest, I had no idea that people had submitted my name, so it was a complete surprise. But it's always an honor when you receive recognition like this. But it's been just a great honor working on behalf of the beef cattle industry. So.
I guess before I go there, what does the recognition mean to you?
I know some of the people who were involved in submitting the application, and it's great to be recognized. I know some others who we helped get into the Hall of Fame. Minister Ritz was one of those. So. There's some great contributions that many have made, and it's gratifying to be included in that group.
Let's go back. How did all this start? How did you get drawn into the beef sector?
Grew up on a ranch.
You had no choice.
Yeah, well, I was fortunate enough to be on a ranch. If you're from west of Highway 2 in the Nanton area, that's ranching country. That was ingrained in you from the minute you were born, I think. But some of the finest ranching country anywhere on the planet. I've had the good fortune to travel to most of the beef producing areas, and there's no place more spectacular than the Porcupine Hills in Southern Alberta. And then from there, I went to Olds College and studied livestock production, and then kind of worked as a nutritionist for a short period of time in High River, and then I saw the opportunity come up with the Alberta Cattle Commission. They were looking for a market information and field services officer, so I applied and fortunately got the job, and that's where I got to meet Chris Mills, who were mentioned mentors. He's probably had the most profound influence on my career of anyone I've ever worked with, and I've worked with some really great people.
So why was Chris why did he have such a profound impact?
If you knew Chris, he wasn't the warmest person, on the surface, but he really was a great individual. He probably, in terms of just looking at things and seeing the big picture. I've never met anyone who was more capable of doing that. And also, he wouldn't just see the big picture. He'd see what you need to do to affect change positively. And some people remember he was really the driving force behind getting rid of the crow's nest freight rate, which had been holding back processing and feeding industries on the prairies. And he started many of these things we kind of take for granted, cows and fish and different programs like that. But he was just could see things and paid attention. He also was a leader. He gave us a chance, but he would as you're moving through these things, sometimes you need a nudge in a particular direction, or you need support when you just need more assistance moving forward. And was always great at doing that. And certainly I got to succeed him as the manager of the Alberta Cattle Commission, which I did for 5 years before I then was fortunate enough to get the job with the Canadian Cattle Association.
When you came to the CCA, what was your first role then?
We started general manager, but quickly became the executive vice president. So it was essentially the chief executive officer. I was the senior staff person.
Okay.
And what was interesting is that at that point in time, you'd seen through the 80s, the industry, a number of things were happening during that period of time. We just worked actively in getting the Canada-US trade agreement. There was an election fought on that. That was put in place. Cargill had decided to build their plant in High River. We had seen with the crow's nest freight rate originally, there was a crow's nest freight rate offset program, then it was removed, and you saw that was the beginning of the real tremendous growth in the feeding industry in Southern Alberta. So as the industry was shifting, one of my first jobs, which wasn't as popular in some parts of the country, was to move the office from the Toronto Stockyards to the Stockman Centre in Calgary.
Now it feels so natural, but at that time it was probably a really big deal.
It was, and there were staff to, some that would relocate, some that wouldn't, but that was one of the first jobs. But we had a lot of things that were going on. I'd work to create the Canada Beef Export Federation. So I was its first executive director while we were getting it started, and then we hired Andrew Rafel to take over that job. But it was also beginning our work in creating promotion programs in Japan, in Korea in particular, in Taiwan. So that was the genesis of those efforts, and to start to get, whether it was Alberta beef or Canadian beef. It started with Alberta when I was doing this, but get that recognition that we were a producer of high quality grain fed beef. So that was, I'd call the 90s the years of growth and really transition in our industry. As we were going around it, we'd been through 15 years of decline in demand as we got towards 1995. And there were a few things we felt that we really needed to focus on. If, they're pretty much in Canada and the US, but our product quality and consistency, some was absolutely incredible, but we had it too many times where it just wasn't tender enough, or it wasn't meeting that high mark. And we changed the grading system. It started kind of discussion papers in 91, 92, and it takes time to change regulations. But that's when we replaced the A1, A2, A3 grade, which was based on yield, with the AAA, AAA, and Prime. And we also created the Canada Choice grade. We haven't really used it, but it was recognizing that we're trading cattle across the fed animals across the border. And we needed grading systems, particularly when we were valuing animals, that we weren't putting our packers at a disadvantage. And increasingly, we're selling more beef into the United States. So greater emphasis on quality in the grading system. And then after it was implemented, we also changed marketing where we focused a lot more on how to prepare products. You still see grilling steaks and you see braising and these. But when all that came into effect in 1995, 96, we actually stopped that erosion in demand. And since that time, we saw quite a steady but important improvement in demand. If you're going to have the most expensive meat product that people want to purchase, it better deliver every single time you sell it to them. Not a big surprise, but so there was a lot of energy went into quality during that period of time, went into consistency. We actually pioneered and developed the first commercially available instrument grading system, which was CVS. E plus V looks remarkably similar to it, but improving the accuracy of our quality assessment systems, all of that took place. Now, during that period of time, we saw a huge increase in feeding and our exports of cattle. At one point, we were exporting 1.6 million head of cattle, and at that point in time, that's when a group south of the border got formed called RCAF, and suddenly we were facing a countervail and anti-dumping case. And unfortunately, our friends in the canola industry are becoming more familiar with anti-dumping. Yeah. But at the time, there just happened to be an article from The Economist that called it the most pernicious form of protectionism. And it really is. It's such a hard one to deal with. And so anyhow, we were tasked, and, especially on the anti-dumping, because they identify respondents based on size in the industry. And then those respondents all basically have to submit information to the Department of Commerce. And they're measuring, are you selling below the home market? Are you selling below cost of production? Of a couple of different factors. And, trying to, you have RCAF, which submitted information which painted the worst possible picture, but that's what they would call best available. And if you don't do this, we went through all of that, and we actually had one pound maker who had a zero out, but there were others, just the way the calculation that there would have been an anti-dumping deposit rate. And that's the hard thing about anti-dumping, is that at the end of the year, they'll recalculate a deposit rate, and you might get some money back, but there's also a chance you're going to have to pay more money. So you don't know when you're selling the animals whether, you've got a greater liability at the end of the year, which is why it is so paralyzing. It's costing millions of dollars a day. Well, we eventually won the injury argument, and that won the case. So that's maybe one of the greater victories that we've enjoyed. I had the task of leading the defense team, and just, Chris was involved. There were a number, Ed Farrell, our counsel south of the border, Dr. Dan Sumner.
I would imagine that Bill Bullard does not send you a Christmas card every year?
No, we don't really exchange pleasantries too often. We also don't see each other much. And
there's RCAF still doing their thing.
We're going to pause there because, of course, we're jumping into the BSE world. We'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
Built on over 100 years of seed innovation and unwavering commitment to farmers, Pioneer 100 Series canola hybrids deliver a step change in yield performance and agronomic traits. This isn't just better canola, it's different canola. Pioneer 100 Series. Contact your local Pioneer sales representative or visit pioneer.com/100 series to learn more today.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
RealAg Radio is Canada's only daily radio show focused on agriculture. Get expert advice on Agronomic Monday. Tuesdays and Wednesdays will cover a broad range of issues. Thursday we'll hear from farmers across the country on the Farmer Rapid Fire. And we'll wrap things up Fridays with the RealAg Issues panel with Kelvin Hepner and Lyndsey Smith. Join us Monday through Friday at 4:30 Eastern. And don't forget about the replay at 7 in the morning on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. My name is Lyndsey Smith, and while I am your host today, mostly you're not going to hear from me. You're going to hear from Shaun Haney in his conversation with Dennis Laycraft just ahead of his induction into the Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame. Before we get to that, though, a reminder that the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute hosting a webinar tomorrow. Our own Kelvin Hepner will be moderating the opening discussion. So just who is CAPI, the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute? Well, CAPI is driving bold policy solutions for a resilient Canadian agri-food system and building a stronger future for Canadian agriculture. Visit capi-icpa.com to discover how, and click on that events page and get yourself registered for the webinar tomorrow. It's all focused on ag innovation. All right, as promised, we go now to the next chapter in Dennis Laycraft's career, and that is, for any of you in the cattle business for any length of time, a very dark chapter in the Canadian beef industry. We're going to talk BSE.
Hey, early 2000s though, that's kind of when I, came back from university and was really what a rude awakening because, BSE 2003, and that was a time period, man. You must have stories from dealing with that situation at that time.
Well, it really was, I call the dark decade, and just prior to that decade and why it was so significant when we got to BSE December 7th, 1993, we actually found a case of BSE in one of the imported animals. And so all of the import, because it wasn't in a domestic animal, it didn't affect our status, but we did remove all of the remaining cattle that had been imported from a country that had BSE. And those animals were destroyed and incinerated. But as a result of that, we took a look and said, boy, we need to be, prepared. We still had measures in place. We were working to make sure we weren't going to get BSE, but we thought we better put a national identification system in place. It wasn't the most popular decision at times, but it became really, really important to have a national identification system that could trace animals back to the herd of origin. We also decided we needed to create a national checkoff. I mentioned some of the marketing efforts, but that was all sort of funded province by province. During that period of time, we went across the country and got the national checkoff established, which would fund the research and the marketing that we kind of take for granted today. But that became a very important development to have those tools available to our industry. And then the National Identification Agency was created as part of that national ID system. So in 1997, we also started with our original feed ban, which was related to BSE. So move forward into the 2000s. 2002, when you start to talk about the dark decade, well, that was the hay west year. We had just this incredible drought across pretty much all of Western Canada, to the point that they were hauling hay west on rail cars and trying to get through that. One of the impacts of that was it meant a lot of feeder cattle went south, which, there's not, any fortune in a drought, but that meant there were fewer cattle on feed in May 2003 because a lot of them had gone south. When I say on feed, some of them might have been in backgrounders, and then in May 2003 was when we got the call that we had a highly probable case of BSE. How many people are aware, but in 2001, there was actually a risk assessment that the CFI did that pretty much felt we were beyond the risk of BSE, back to that 1993 case. So, that's why it was such a shock when we got the call. Now, a lot of things started to happen. We had very, very good relations with our counterparts in the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, but we also had good relations with, the Secretary of Agriculture and their staff down there, Secretary Veneman. Dale Moore was the chief of staff, worked for NCBA, and, many people. So, we were kept them informed, what was happening. We always work closely with them on animal health issues. And people have heard me say this, but when you get into a crisis, it's a lot easier to look to your friends than to look for friends.
Well put.
And that very first day, because we'd had all of these measures in place before, we're confident that we had prevented any significant amplification, where if we hadn't done any of those things, it could have been spreading freely within the herd. And I remember on the press release or the press conference, Secretary Veneman said she's confident that Canadian beef is safe. And, that was important. We then established, when I say we were working with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, this international panel that helped kind of oversaw our investigation. We created the BSE roundtable, which I chaired for all of the years it existed until it just became the Beef Value Chain Roundtable. Mm-hmm. And, we saw something pretty remarkable occur between May 20th and Father's Day. We started with a few companies, I'm not sure we'll carry Canadian beef. They saw what had happened in Japan and it happened in Europe. And one of the more compelling things that happened was in Regina. There was I won't mention who it was, but one of our fast food outlets had indicated they weren't going to carry Canadian beef. And there was a 4-H group from Mortlach, Saskatchewan, went there and picketed, and all these young juniors picketing that won't carry. Well, that hit national news, and already, the mood had shifted where everybody felt we were being unfairly treated with the trade restrictions.
Yeah. Well, Dennis, I remember like in Lethbridge on the West Side Safeway, there was like reefer trucks. Mm-hmm. And people from all over the city and the area coming to buy direct to, we're going to eat our way out of this. Protein consumption was up in those early days. Well,
we started to see, this shift that it wasn't that, they weren't going to carry Canadian beef. They were going to carry only Canadian beef.
Right.
So we went from, this question to suddenly it was, we saw Canadians rally around our industry in a way that I don't know that anyone's ever seen before.
May never see again. Really.
Barbecues across the country.
Yeah.
In July 2003, beef consumption went up 76%.
Wow.
You saw those, you might recall those huge chubs of beef. There are people walking out with those, and I'm not sure. I eat a lot of beef, and that's a lot of hamburger.
That's a lot of hamburger
to work with. But it was that probably did more for the morale as we're going through this, because as soon as that case was announced, the market became completely paralyzed. Nobody knew what animals were worth. We just happened to be in between. We had our 5-year. We had growing together, growing forward. Then it became the partnership agreements with the FBT. Yeah. Well, they hadn't actually agreed on a new program. So the previous programs had expired on April 1st. So by May 20th and the weeks that followed, we actually didn't have the support programs in place. So we were trying to negotiate and something, and we ended up with first a failed ad hoc program, which we told them wouldn't work.
Yeah.
After that, we started to get some better programs, but we went from where people didn't know what animals were worth to trying to get more processing capacity up and running. And one of the important things on August 10th, we saw the U.S. announced they were going to reopen to Canadian beef from boneless beef cattle from cattle under 30 months. That led to Mexico making an announcement fairly soon, and it wasn't too much later that Japan opened up again, but it was for under 18 months.
Yeah. But those borders reopened, but I think it's important, though, and those of us in the beef sector know this, there was a hangover for a long time. We lost a lot of people that maybe were a mixed operation. They had had a job in town but they had 50 pairs or 100 pairs, or we just lost a lot of the sector. And then there also was the financial side of it, where it became this reason why it had impacts on the size of the cow herd longer term. Maybe we're still dealing with today until this recent price run, right?
Well, you got kind of the inverse problem to start with, because cows were hardly worth taking to market, and fed cattle were trading for $1.04 on the day before, or the Friday before the announcement, and suddenly they were dropping down where we didn't know what value to place on them, and if you don't know what fed cattle are going to be worth, you don't know what feeder cattle are going to be worth. So you're back to that paralyzed market, and it took some time before we started to get some legs under, and we were, processing, a number of governments. I'll give, lots of credit to, the Alberta government, for instance, stepped in these plants. One of the things, there's certain products we could sell everything of, but, we were exporting a lot of the trim, and, that was having to go to rendering. And so there's a program, so we're able to get that trim moved out so we could operate at a higher capacity. And we actually, it took a while to get more, expansion in the hacking industry, but we got over 100,000 head a day at one point at the peak. Now that took almost, 13, 14 months to get there. But initially we ended up building this huge inventory of cattle, and then we had this wall of cattle in front of us that were getting bigger, that we were trying to get through the processing industry. And we worked in, a lot of people sat down and created this set-aside program so that we could manage cattle going to market. So that, we'd work our way through that. There was an effort to also, manage some of the heifers that we didn't have room for them to go into the feeding industry. And there were a number of different programs that came into place. And finally, we got up to that capacity, and then the border opened.
What an absolute whirlwind. And I remember it fondly. And so this is the point where I'm going to ask anyone, if you feel like sharing your experience with BSE and exactly that, the dark decade, you can always zip us an email at lsmith or Haney at RealAgriculture.com, or text or call that feedback line, 1-855-776-6147. All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more of our conversation with Dennis Laycraft right after this.
What were the issues in your fields this year? Did you do a soil sample? What is your soil sample telling you about some of the nutrient issues that you might be having going into next year? What herbicides did you use? What residues you might be concerned about? What weed issues did you have? What crop residues did you have? How well do you know your fields?
Get the answers to all the questions you have about your pulse crop at the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. Hey Alberta canola growers, now's your chance to shape the future of canola research. Complete the online Alberta Canola Research Survey by October 27th and you could win one of 4 $100 Visa gift cards. Go to albertacanola.com/survey because great research starts with farmer insight. All right, I am your host for the day, Lyndsey Smith, but hey, let's hop back to our conversation with Dennis Laycraft and Shaun Haney right now.
July 25th, 2005, where then we could move live cattle south, and then you actually had the full capacity, both domestically and competitive bidding with the U.S. That was a turning point. We then moved into the next bigger challenge facing our industry as we headed. That was the first time we started to see labor problems developing in the packing industry, but then we headed into this kind of hyper cost shift where you saw by 2007 oil was trading all the way up to $140 some a barrel. Then you had the financial collapse. But during that period of time, we got up to $1.10 Canadian dollar. We'd gone from a 67-cent dollar to $1.10. So we had this huge increase in our currency, and then things like fuel were going up and real estate was going up, and then the crash occurred and our great recession occurred. So we went from that peak in July of 2007 into 2008, but it was really December 2007 where the great collapse, and suddenly oil was trading for 35. And by January, there were sometimes they had to pay to get rid of it.
Yeah.
So, in the middle of a great recession, then that obviously impacts demand. So, you went from a couple of the major events, the highest currency values since the 70s to the greatest recession since the early 80s. Some of us that lived through high interest rates in the early 80s will argue which was worse. Just by seeing some people paying 24% interest.
Yeah. Through some of those really difficult times, like you just described, who are some of the people that you really leaned on to try to work through some of those major challenges?
We had such a great group of directors, and Neil Yonke was our president when BSE happened, but we worked. It was Ben, and we lost Carl back in the late 90s, but Carl Black was instrumental in getting the ID system, and Ben, I think the two of them moved and seconded the resolution to get that done. We had Stan Eby who took over from Neil when Neil finished out his term, and we had lots of leaders like Brad Wildham and Hugh Lynch Staunton. Travis Taze was very, very active during that period of time. And I could go down a long list, but we worked very closely with Minister Van Cleef at the time when it happened. And, there was a lot of movement back and forth. It was just pretty much non-stop or stop effort through there. Chris Mills behind the scenes was providing advice. I remember getting lots of calls from past leaders, and good advice, like, encouragement to get through all of this. But gosh, there's so many people that stand out. Minister McClellan in Alberta stood out as well during those days that we needed to get moving through there. And, I won't go into those who didn't distinguish themselves as well. Kind of took advantage of the situation, but anyhow.
Yeah. And you mentioned the National ID program, and I think inside of Canada, we sort of we have it at this point. But we don't think of it in the context where the US still does not have one, right? And Canada had ours for, as you described, a very long time.
Yeah, and we're going to be, there are changes to improve the traceability part of it. The U.S. in theory has one, but it just, for interstate. So some of the states are doing a lot more, but it is an important tool to have. And I hope we don't need it for that reason again, but there's a reason we've worked hard to get a vaccine bank in place, and we have the biosecurity protocols that we have in quality or in our verified beef plus. It was originally called Quality Starts Here. And, just preparation, so that in the event something ever happens again, you don't want to ever waste a crisis. You want to learn what you can from it and be, I'm not sure you'll never be completely prepared for a border closing event, but you do what you can to be ready.
You may have more Air Canada miles than anybody that I know. How many do you got to be? Have they bought you a jet yet?
Well, one of the things when I mentioned the 80s, and then as we headed in the 90s, we got to the point where we were exporting 70% of our production.
Yeah.
So a big part of our goal at the Beef Export Federation and all this work was we needed to, you don't diversify from the Canada-U.S. market, you diversify above the Canada-U.S. market. So, we export today into 59 countries. And products we sell outside of Canada-U.S. add about $440 we just did this analysis a month and a half ago with current values, $440 to every animal. So it was really some of it was back and forth to Washington a lot, whether it was and to Geneva a lot during the WTO cases. But a lot of it was really focusing on market access. How do we make sure we have this? So I've got quite a few air miles. But to me, the gratifying part now is, we pretty well have the best market access we have since, even before, we've seen more liberalization as a result of CPTPP. We'll have phased out tariffs in a few years. In Korea, Japan, has dropped from 38 and it'll be down to 9% tariffs. So, unfortunately right now, that whole global trading system is under tremendous strain with what's happening. But for a country like Canada, especially Canadian agriculture that depends so heavily on exports and on trade, that we should be one of the growth industries. And it is going to be driven because we are one of the very best high quality agriculture producers in the world. And, that was always our focus, not only to get market access, but to get fully recognized for the superior quality of our product. And, to see the record prices we have today, there's decades of work and relationship with the U.S. that really supports why we're seeing what we're seeing today. And so my wife probably has a different view on my air miles or the time away from here. One of the other parts of the May 2003 story was, I had a very young family. My son was just turned 5 months, and my daughter was, I guess it would have been 19 months old. So, fortunately, I had the family support that there was a lot of times for 6 months I didn't buy a return ticket. It was from one meeting to another, and that, it was a survival period for our industry.
Yeah, there is, I think sometimes we don't talk about that kind of stuff enough in some of those sacrifices. Do you, and from a trade perspective, you mentioned the extra value per animal or per carcass. I think a lot of times we always talk about, when we think about the carcass, we think about what we consume in North America. We think about, the tenderloin, and we think about we're going to have a roast, but we need to have trade into some of those markets like you described to up the total value that the producer ultimately receives. If we're not shipping tongues into parts of Asia or whatever, different parts of the offal, if we're not doing that, then back to the farm gate, they're getting less money.
The overall value of trade, and it was all part of that strategy I talked about in the 90s, and I described it. We wanted to get the product right and get the right product to the right customer. I've told this story at a few recent meetings. I got a picture. I was in Tokyo at the Costco, which happens to be the person who runs it's from Saskatchewan. Costco Japan, not just Costco Tokyo.
Right.
Great person for us to work with. And we've got Canadian beef in Costco, in Japan, but they were selling in this counter barbecue tongue, which they, is almost a staple over there. Fresh barbecue tongue beside fresh barbecue strip loin, and the fresh barbecue tongue was selling at a higher price than strip loins.
Wow.
So to give you an idea, but our short plates, our short ribs, the reason if you go to the store right now, and I enjoy a good short rib, but they're pretty expensive. Yeah. It's because of this tremendous demand in Asia that pulls that up, and we're making our cattle bigger. Well, over there, the way they like big shoulder clods.
We are going to take a quick break here on RealAg Radio and continue our conversation with Dennis Laycraft and Shaun Haney right after this.
If you only listen to RealAg Radio, you only get half the picture. For greater insight into the issues that affect farming, tune in to RealAgriculture.com. Crops, livestock, machinery, farm management, and the markets, even food and travel. Real Agriculture Online digs deeper into the topics that affect the way you work and live. So get connected today. Read, watch, and listen to the people who know at RealAgriculture.com.
I'm Lyndsey Smith, host of The Agronomist, and I want to thank you for tuning in for over 200 episodes of our beloved little program. Join me Monday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern on YouTube for our live and interactive agronomy Q&A. Each week, our guest panel will handle some of your toughest agronomic questions live, streaming on YouTube, Facebook, X, and RealAgriculture.com. Tune in Monday nights or go to RealAgriculture.com/agronomist and sign up for our email notifications and don't miss an episode. Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. It's Wednesday, October 22nd, and I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. We hop back to our conversation between Dennis Laycraft and Shaun Haney, and just a quick reminder, I did have to trim out, pun intended, some of this interview. So check out RealAgriculture.com for the full interview and video of this discussion. But let's hop now to the last segment of the show, Dennis Laycraft and Shaun Haney.
So, as you think about this induction into the Hall of Fame, and I'm going to ask all the different inductees this, 20 years from now, and we're looking at the list, and Dennis Laycraft. Yeah. What do you want them to be? What do you want their thoughts to be about your career and your contribution to the industry?
Well, I think it's always been about the industry. Right now, we turned a corner. If you went through the decade, the 2010 to 2020, we're seeing this pervasive attitude. It was completely with a false narrative that the cattle industry is bad for the environment. We need to shift to a plant-based diet. I think we've been able to change that considerably. We created the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. We've done those sustainability assessments, and BCRC's done the work that shows that, we have one of the best environment stories to tell in the beef industry in the world, but also, when you take a look at the grasslands, you take a look at, how we can help reduce waste, and actually a very positive role. So, hopefully 25 years from now, people are looking back at the cattle industry and are looking currently at the cattle industry thinking, one of the great industries that Canada has, we're helping feed the world. It's great for the environment. And, everybody putting a steak on that night would probably bring me the greatest smile. So.
Young people coming into the industry, whether they're on the industry side or on the primary side, we're always talking about the youth. And I remember, well, you probably feel the same. At one time you were the youth, and all of a sudden that's not the case anymore. What advice would you have for people coming into the industry?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned we just had our semi-annual meeting, and there's two things that we do there. We have a large competition for our cattle young leaders program. There's usually around 70 people, and then select down to 24, which is really hard. And then the 24 come and there's a competition for 16 to become our CYLs for the year, and they get partnered up with mentors. So if young people get a chance to apply for that program, some of the people that contribute, I think you've served as a mentor, if I'm not mistaken. And, I served, there's been many industry leaders serve, and it's created lifelong friendships among them. It's also created lifelong friendships between the mentee and mentor.
Yes.
And, we also had 16 graduates. So it was the 24 and the 16 at the meeting who all bond together there. So, and the interns, but, sort of my greater message, and right now it's probably different. Right now, if you look at Canadian agriculture, it's been a long time since we've seen, the cow-calf sector probably being the most profitable part of Canadian agriculture. But it really is this year. It's one of those remarkable ones. But, I've never been more excited about the future. We continue to see demand grow in Asia for beef. Mm-hmm. It's high quality protein, and it's growing for beef. They like grain-fed beef. We're one of the most efficient grain-fed beef producers in the world. And, there's going to be greater recognition of how important it is we maintain grasslands and the role of that for our environment. So I truly believe there is, it's, the biggest challenge is the cost of getting into the business. But, getting into the business, it's still one of the best ways to raise a family in the world is, doing that. But we do believe strongly there's going to be a great future for the Canadian beef industry. We continue to grow and evolve. That's the nature of any industry. But when you see the demand for what we produce continue to grow, and, we'll go through cycles, that's inevitable. But, each time, I'm optimistic we'll see, sort of the highs and the lows. The lows might be where the previous highs were, and then you'll set new highs, but you are always working hard, and we've got the foundation in place with, whether it's the research that's being done, it's our public and stakeholder engagement, really, telling that incredible story that we have our young leaders programs. I'm pretty optimistic about the future.
You mentioned $1.04 on that Friday before the BSE in 2003. Did you ever think we'd be talking about these kind of prices like we're seeing today?
Well, this went faster than I expected. I'll be honest. I mean, it tight supplies, but there's a very interesting article in the U.S. about how much, their whole diet is really built around beef.
Yeah.
It's such a strong demand, and we have great loyalty here in Canada as well. So, with that strong foundation in Canada and the U.S., and then the growing market in Asia, it's, you can't predict, but we do know supplies are going to be tight moving into next year and probably the year after. So, I think there's a pretty strong set of fundamentals right now. But yeah, $3,000 calves was, it's for the people that are getting it, it's certainly going to make up for some years that were pretty hard. So,
Dennis, thanks so much for taking the time for us here today. And again, congratulations on your induction into the 2025 Canadian Agricultural Hall of Fame and being a member of a very, very great class. And enjoy the ceremony and the portrait unveiling. And honestly, so well deserved. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And hopefully we may see you in Victoria.
Yes, that's right. The Canadian Agriculture Hall of Fame inductee ceremony happens November 8th in Victoria. Let us know if you're going to be there. All right. Thank you so much for joining me here on RealAg Radio. I will be back tomorrow to host the Farmer Rapid Fire, of course, happening 4:30 Eastern right here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. Cheers, everybody. Have a great Wednesday.